Today on the Daily Dose, Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks was commuting home after a long day as a working seamstress, seated in the front row of the segregated blacks-only back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. When the front of the bus filled up with too many white passengers, driver J. Fred Blake asked Parks and three others to vacate their seats. And while the other riders complied, Parks had reached a tipping point in the segregated South. Refusing to give up her seat, she was promptly arrested and fined $14. Her arrest would trigger a second tipping point when black civil rights leaders and black bus riders alike kicked off a bus boycott, demanding equal rights as American citizens. Upon her arrest, Parks phoned Edie Nixon, a prominent black leader, who bailed her out before convincing 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., the pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, to lead and inspire the first major civil rights protest in America. Roughly 40,000 black bus riders boycotted the Montgomery bus system beginning on December 5th, which represented 75% of all bus riders in the southern city of 120,000 residents. Initially, the protesters' demands did not include changing the segregation laws, but rather, the group demanded courtesy, the hiring of black drivers, and a first-come, first-seated policy, with whites entering and filling the seats at the front of the bus, while blacks entered and sat in the rear. Ultimately, however, a group of 5 black Montgomery women affiliated with the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, sued the city, seeking to have busing segregation laws totally invalidated. As a result of Montgomery's bus boycott, on June 5, 1956, a Montgomery federal court ruled that any law requiring racially segregated seating violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which was adopted after the Civil War and guaranteed all Americans, regardless of race, equal rights and equal protection under state and federal laws. The city of Montgomery appealed the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, which upheld the lower court's decision on December 20, 1956. The boycott ended the following day, 381 days after it began. Today on the Daily Dose, Ruby Bridges. Born during the early years of the Civil Rights Movement, just 3 months and 21 days after the Supreme Court's 1954 decision, Brown v. Board of Education, at the age of 5, Ruby Bridges attended a segregated kindergarten until significant federal pressure forced the Orleans Parish School District to admit black children into all-white segregated schools. In early 1960, Bridges was one of 6 black children in New Orleans who passed a test to determine whether they could attend the all-white William Frantz Elementary School, a test primarily designed to slow and impede desegregation efforts. 2 stayed at their old school, 3 transferred to another all-white school, while Ruby Bridges alone attended William Frantz Elementary. On November 14, 1960, 6-year-old Ruby and her mother Lucille approached Frantz Elementary despite a throng of angry white protesters who threw objects and shouted angry racist epitaphs. Escorted into school by 4 federal marshals, years later, Charles Burks, one of the marshals in attendance, recalled that Ruby showed a lot of courage. She never cried, she didn't whimper, she just marched along like a little soldier, and we're all so very proud of her. White parents quickly began pulling their children out of classrooms, obliging Barbara Henry, a teacher from Boston, Massachusetts, to teach Bridges for an entire year on a one-on-one basis. A day later, Methodist minister Lloyd Anderson Foreman was the first white parent to escort his 5-year-old daughter past the angry mob, until one by one, white students returned to Frantz Elementary to resume their studies. During the early days of desegregation in New Orleans schools, as Bridges walked to school each morning, One white woman repeatedly threatened to poison her, while another held up a black baby doll in a coffin, until even the worst racist haters began to accept the inevitability of the federal government's desegregation mandates. Today, Ruby Bridges has published 4 books on her youthful story and the ongoing need for racial tolerance and acceptance, at the same time receiving many honorable degrees and awards along the way. Now chair of the Ruby Bridges Foundation, the group's mission is to promote the values of tolerance, respect, and appreciation of all differences. Racism is a grown-up disease, Bridges maintains, and we must stop using our children to spread it, making Ruby Bridges one of the leading voices in America's slow embrace of racial equality. And there you have it, Ruby Bridges, today on the Daily Dose. Today in the Daily Dose, Selma's Bloody Sunday. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, nearly a century after the abolition of slavery in America, civil rights activists focused their attention on Dallas County, Alabama, where more than half the population was black, yet less than 2% of black residents were registered to vote. On Sunday, March 7th, activist John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Uzziah Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Council led some 600 protesters from the Brown Chapel AME Church in Selma on a planned 54-mile march to Alabama's capital city of Montgomery in an attempt to meet directly with Alabama Governor George Wallace in a high-profile appeal for African American voting rights. Walking through Selma unimpeded, when the protesters reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after a Confederate general and reputed Grand Dragon of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan, the marchers were stopped by a wall of state police, wearing riot gear and gas masks, as they slapped their billy clubs against their hands in open anticipation, while spectators waved Confederate flags, with an equal sense of impending violence. It would be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, Major John Cloud called out through a bullhorn. This is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse. Go home or go to your church. Instead, when the marchers failed to turn around, the troopers advanced like a phalanx of hate, brutally assaulting the protesters with clubs, bullwhips, and rubber tubing wrapped in barbed wire, all in front of news cameras who captured the violence amid an uproar of cheers from reveling white bystanders. Although ultimately forced back, in the spirit of nonviolent protest advocated by Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi before him, the marchers refused to fight back. Hours later, when ABC News anchor Frank Reynolds interrupted the network's star-studded premiere of the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, nearly 50 million Americans witnessed the brutal savagery of what would become known as Bloody Sunday. Outrage swept a slowly awakening nation, leading to sit-ins and demonstrations of white solidarity, making Selma's Bloody Sunday a turning point moment in a nation's slow embrace of equal rights. Today in the Daily Dose, the 13th Amendment. 243 years after the first slaves arrived in North America, in 1862, during the height of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, which gave Southern slaveholding states 100 days to rejoin the Union, at the same time ending the institution of slavery. When Lincoln and the Union failed to receive a response from the Confederate South, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation turned into law on New Year's Day, 1863, declaring that all slaves are thenceforward and forever free. At the same time, Lincoln understood that his decree applied only to territories currently part of the Union states, but his proclamation's symbolic stand shifted the North's Civil War objectives from not only preserving the Union as a solitary nation, but for the abolition of slavery from American soil. Realizing that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation would have no constitutional teeth after the end of the Civil War, Lincoln and the U.S. Congress began work on a constitutional amendment which would formally abolish slavery under federal law. In response, the U.S. Senate passed a proposed anti-slavery amendment in April of 1864. However, the process faltered in the House of Representatives when Democrats resisted its passage under the weight of an election year. After Lincoln was soundly reelected to a second term as president, in December of 1864, Lincoln's hands-on approach to the legislative process, combined with an emboldened Republican Party, to push the 13th Amendment through the House on January 31, 1865. After the amendment passed with the required two-thirds majority vote of 119 yeas to 56 nays. Lincoln would not see the final ratification of the 13th Amendment, which passed the Senate on December 6, when on the evening of April 14, 1865, actor and assassin John Wilkes Booth murdered Lincoln at Ford's Theater less than a week after the end of the Civil War. Together with the 14th and 15th Amendments passed during the Reconstruction era, the 13th Amendment sought to bring about equality for African Americans, yet pushback from Southern states saw the rise of black codes and Jim Crow laws, which continued to segregate African Americans until the Civil Rights Movement combined with voting and anti-segregation laws of the mid-1960s, making the 13th Amendment a vast step forward in America's slow embrace of racial equality. Today in the Daily Dose, the 14th Amendment. Outraged by the leniency President Andrew Johnson granted the Confederate states during Reconstruction, Northern Republicans began work on the 14th Amendment in response to the segregationist black codes enacted by former slaveholding Southern states. While the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution abolished slavery, at the same time protecting the rights of black Americans, the 14th Amendment would further define the legal definitions of equality under federal law. In response to the Supreme Court's notorious 1857 Dred Scott decision, which claimed that a black man, even if born free, could not claim rights of citizenship under the federal Constitution, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment greatly expanded the civil and legal rights of all Americans by protecting them from state-imposed infringements such as the Black Codes of the South. Section 2 repealed the 3/5 clause from the original unamended Constitution, which stated that a slave counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of counting the population for congressional representation. Clause 3 of Section 2 forbade state governments from racial discrimination without the due process of law, which would later play a key role in many benchmark civil rights cases. In Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, Congress now had the authority to bar public officials from office if they engaged in insurrection or rebellion, which effectively barred former leaders of the Confederacy from regaining power within the U.S. government after securing a presidential pardon. Section 4 abolished payment of any debt owed to the now-defunct Confederate states, while banning any payment to former slaveholders as compensation for their loss of human property. Taken as a whole, the 14th Amendment of 1868 effectively shifted the balance of power between the federal and state governments, which was later challenged by the 1896 Supreme Court decision entitled Plessy v. Ferguson, which claimed that racially segregated public facilities failed to violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, a decision that allowed Jim Crow laws to flourish in the segregated South for decades to come. 68 years later, President Lyndon Baines Johnson would use the authority of the 14th Amendment to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, making the 13th, 14th, and later 15th Amendments a lasting triumvirate to the spirit and law of human equality. Today on the Daily Dose, the 15th Amendment. In response to Black Code post-Civil War laws enacted by most Southern states, intended to segregate African Americans while blocking them from the ballot box. In 1867, despite its immediate veto by President Andrew Johnson, a Republican-dominated U.S. Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act, which divided the South into 5 military districts intended to protect the constitutional rights of African Americans. Known as carpetbaggers or scalawags, Northern Republicans also sent in temporary and oftentimes profiteering leaders to ensure the rights of African Americans, making the period one of the most racially progressive experiences in the region's otherwise dark history of segregation. 3 years later, Congress added weight to the first Reconstruction Act by passing the 15th Amendment, which stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. While both the 14th and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution guaranteed equality and voting rights to African Americans, Southern legislators ended Reconstruction with the Compromise of 1877, which was a backroom deal that propelled losing presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes into the White House, provided Reconstruction in the South came to an immediate end. The deal would end forced desegregation in the Southern states, ushering in 87 more years of repressive Jim Crow laws across the region. Beginning with the ratification of the 24th Amendment in 1964, which made poll taxes illegal on federal elections, the same practice would be banned on state elections after a 1966 ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law on August 6 of that same year, which was enacted to make illegal all barriers at the state and local level designed to circumvent African American voting rights laid down by the 15th Amendment, including literacy tests and poll taxes applied solely to African Americans. After a century of black codes and Jim Crow laws in the segregated South, African Americans at long last had the legal means to challenge restrictive voting laws, which combined with the civil rights movement of the 1960s to witness a substantial rise in black voter turnout against lingering and oftentimes violent segregationist sentiment in the South. Today in the Daily Dose, the Black Panthers. Following the assassination of black nationalist leader Malcolm X and the murder of an unarmed black teen by San Francisco police, activists Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale formed the Black Panthers or Black Panther Party in October of 1966, which was a socialist, armed self-defense group with the primary goal of pushing back on police brutality against blacks. Taking advantage of a California law that allowed citizens to carry fully loaded, unconcealed guns, the Black Panthers began shadowing Oakland police with guns at the ready, representing a clear break from the integrationist goals and nonviolent protest tactics of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Spreading quickly to other American cities with large minority populations, by 1968, the Black Panthers had grown to some 2,000 members, spreading Newton and Seale's political objectives drawn up in their 10-point program, including the immediate end to police brutality, employment for African Americans, fair housing and justice for all. While the Panthers were able to institute community social programs such as free breakfast for school children and free health clinics in 13 African American communities, the group soon bogged down into violence, including Panther treasurer Bobby Hutton's death in a shootout with police in April of 1968, followed by Newton's conviction and imprisonment for killing Oakland police officer John Fry. The Panthers' socialist message and militant tactics soon made them a target of the FBI's secret counterintelligence program called COINTELPRO, leading FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to call the Black Panthers one of the greatest threats to the nation's internal security. Hoover's declaration triggered an open season by police against the Panthers in each of their chapter cities, leading to the 1969 murder of Panther members Fred Hampton and Mark Clark during an ambush by Chicago police. Killed while sleeping in their apartment, a ballistics investigation into the more than 100 rounds fired in the apartment determined that only one round came from the Panther side of the exchange. After a federal grand jury ruled that the Bureau played a significant role in the lead-up to the raid, the Black Panthers officially disbanded in 1982, making the Black Panther Party a violent participant during the turbulent years of the American 60s.